Greetings. I'd like to spend a few moments talking about genocide prevention and intervention. One of the things that we note is that there's been many failures at preventing genocides as well as other human rights violations. And we may wonder what combination of prevention strategies might actually work from preventing genocides, and what are the barriers to preventing genocide. What kinds of questions do we need to address as researchers and scholars in regards to these failures to intervene? And have some interventions to prevent genocide actually created further harm? And when interventions seem to enable the genocidal perpetrators, how do we address this? And then finally, what are the moral and ethical obligations of other nations to prevent and intervene in cases of genocide? Stanton has provided a model that is used quite frequently in looking at the process of a genocide occurring. And so he has 8 stages of genocide. And I want to go over those real briefly. The first stage is classification. And that is kind of the us versus them idea being presented. So you see the differentiation of groups, which will eventually become a perpetrator group and victim groups. The second stage is symbolization, where these classifications become symbolized. The third stage, dehumanization, is where the victim groups are viewed as less than human or not human. And we've seen cases where the victim groups are referred to as vermin, as cancer, as lice, as cockroaches, and so on. The fourth stage is the organization stage, where the perpetrator groups become more organized and present their propaganda and ideology or belief systems in a more organized way to a wider range of the population. The fifth stage, polarization, focuses on even becoming more specific with the particular groups, and even moderates may be targeted for discrimination and eventually killing. In the sixth stage, preparation, plans are developed to carry out genocide, and often here we see trial massacres. The seventh stage is the extermination stage, where the killing takes place. That's actually where the genocidal behavior occurs. And the eighth stage is referred to as denial, and that is where the perpetrator group either denies or attempts to justify their genocidal behavior. So these 8 stages have been used to study various genocides that have occurred, and this model is very useful. Applying it to prevention or intervention would be very helpful, especially if other nation states were able to or were to intervene early on during the first 1 or 2 or 3 stages instead of waiting to the later stages. And Stanton points out that a lot of times early warnings are ignored, and that many genocides could have been prevented, and that policymakers often deny or avoid what's going on in the genocidal country. And often we'll see that countries do not want to participate because they don't want to spend the money, or they don't want it to deploy their military to intervene. And so we have to think about the different methodologies that might be used that could be helpful. Dr. Harf presents a risk assessment model looking at risks for genocide, looking at, for example, prior genocides or excluding people from everyday interactions, authoritarian regimes, and closed societies become at greater risk for massacres and genocide, and the history of the instability of a country, and also the history and the practice of systematic discrimination, all play a role in risk factors. And one of the things, of course, that we know is, and Harf points this out, is that peacekeeping can work, and that we would want to also consider using post-war justice as a deterrent, so that leaders see that action is actually taken when they engage in genocidal behavior. Harf also points out another lesson, and that is that supporting rebels in a country can be dangerous. And we see this a huge debate now throughout various conflicts that are currently going on regarding U.S. policy in aiding or supporting certain rebel groups. We also see that other factors may reduce the risk of genocide, or in post-genocidal societies decrease the risk for additional violence, and some of those are post-settlement security and also youth employment, which Harf believes leads to stability and reduces the risk of further violence. In essence, Harf points out timing is the key regarding interventions. Other models have been presented to predict genocide by Porter and Charney, which offer a variety of useful information. And there's some overlap with these models, of course. Dr. Toten pointed out in his article, The State and Future of Genocide Studies and Prevention, an overview and analysis of some key issues back in 2011, that when he first entered the field in 1986, there were very few researchers studying genocide. And it was really during the 1980s to 1990s we see the establishment of genocide centers, and then we begin to see more journals, we see more books, more research, and expansion of a focus on different genocides. We see the international criminal tribunals, which we'll talk about in more detail when we discuss Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. And we also see the making of the International Criminal Court. And so we see a lot going on, now basically, and really a lot of this has occurred in the last 15 or 20 years. Totem points out that some of the barriers to prevention and intervention are simply the lack of political will of other nations, and also problems with the UN Security Council. The U.S., Britain, France, China, and Russia have permanent are permanent members with veto power, and so you get into this problem of these groups may not identify, or may refuse to identify. These countries may refuse to identify when a genocide is occurring, calling it either civil war or massacres or ethnic violence or something else, but not genocide. Because if they label it as genocide, then they have an obligation to intervene. Toten also points out that we should focus on conflict resolution strategies, diplomacy, and peacemaking, and also to carefully monitor hotspots. And then he finally asks, should genocide scholars engage in activism? Cushman, in Dr. Cushman's article, Is Genocide Preventable? Some Theoretical Considerations from the Journal of Genocide Research, points out that the United Nations failed to prevent genocide, and products of modernity facilitated it. For example, modern weapons, modern communication strategies. And Cushman also points out that that we need to address again the structural versus agency debate, and Dr. Cushman points out that it seems like there's more structural explanations than agency in the research and policy studies. And I would point out that it's very possible to merge looking at the social structural factors of genocidal countries as well as the agency, the interactions, and more localized behaviors of individuals and small groups. We can look at all this together in the interactions. And finally, Cushman points out that some of the problems that needs to be addressed, including that the failure of scholars and other experts have failed to come up with ways to actually prevent genocide. Yehuda Bauer looks at genocide prevention and states currently it is hopeless to reform the United Nations and the Security Council. And then Dr. Bauer offers some recommendations to use qualitative and quantitative risk assessments, to use the media to influence public opinion, to provide education about genocide, and to put the United Nations to use with other organizations, and to set up a world humanitarian fund. Goldhagen, in an article, Ending Our Age of Suffering, A Plan to Stop Genocide, in the New Republic back in 2009, talked about the big problem is eliminationism. And this is elimination by force, transformation, repression, expulsion, prevention of reproduction, or extermination. And it's a form of political behavior. And so we also then have to look at how the thought process of the genocidal perpetrators, they realize that the benefits outweigh the costs, and that the UN Convention on Genocide is almost useless. Goldhagen also pointing out that the United Nations is doing more to enable eliminationist leaders than to stop it. And he also points out that we need to look at prevention, intervention, and punishment because these are rarely used. And really, I think Goldhagen has a very strong emphasis that prevention needs to change the mind of the leader by making their genocidal behavior extremely costly. So, to kind of summarize, we need to take a closer look at the process of or what happens that leads to genocides, look at some of the common themes, some of the differences, and to look at what interventions would actually work, and to begin to use those specific interventions that have demonstrated effectiveness, although we don't have a lot to go on. So hopefully we see continued research in this area, and that we get some solid prevention strategies and also intervention techniques going, so we can reach our goal of ending genocide. Thank you.